It's my privilege to introduce my friend, the junior senator from Pennsylvania, Pat Toomey.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you so much. I really, really appreciate that very, very warm reception. Keith Rothfuss, I had absolutely no doubt that Keith Rothfuss was going to be an awesome addition to the Pennsylvania delegation and to the U.S. House of Representatives. The only thing he's done is to exceed my expectations. This guy is going to be absolutely terrific, and it's great to have a rock-solid conservative ally in the House. He's off to a terrific start. I'm thrilled that he's on the Financial Services Committee, where his expertise and his knowledge is going to be just terrific. Keith, thank you for that kind introduction and for all that you're doing. Fred Anton, thank you for your kind words. I thought I overheard you say, Fred, that some are suggesting that your career is fading. Fred, they've said that about you since Teddy Roosevelt was president. It wasn't true then, and it's not true now. Loman Henry, congratulations on another outstanding program. Loman does great work, and he deserves our thanks. And Keith mentioned a number of the things that I've been working on in the Senate. I appreciate that. One of the things Keith did not mention was a cause that I've long been a proponent of and an active participant in, and that's the whole term limits movement. When I was in the House, I pledged to limit myself to no more than 3 terms, and I honored that commitment. And recently, together with David Vitter, the Republican from Louisiana, we introduced legislation that would impose term limits on both House and Senate members. Of course, some would suggest that my recent activity with Joe Manchin is my own effort at term limits for myself. I get that. But I just want to start off by saying we've been through a lot together. You know, I've been in this fight for conservative principles for at least 15 years. Many of you have been in that battle longer than me. And many of these battles we've fought side by side. We've had our victories. We've had our setbacks. I got to tell you, when I've had a chance to support other candidates that I feel strongly about, I've never been more proud of being able to endorse Mike Fulmer and John Eichelberger, terrific guys. I was delighted to support Tom Smith, Keith Rothfuss, and early in his primary to endorse Ted Cruz, who's turned out to be an outstanding senator, no doubt about it. And I want to say how much I appreciate all the work you're doing. I also appreciate the many people who came up to me earlier beforehand and said that they disagree with what I've been doing the last couple of weeks, but that they recognize and respect the many, many years that we've been allies and the overwhelming majority of issues on which we agree, and how you may not agree with me on this one, but we're going to work together going forward. And I want to tell you, I appreciate that very, very much. I want to tell you a little bit about some of the things that I've been working on in the Senate that you wouldn't necessarily read about, but they're important to me. One of the very first things I did when I arrived 2 years ago, I thought it would be very, very constructive if we could begin to unite the Republican Conference of Senators around conservative principles, because it had been a disparate group for a long period of time, and I thought there was an opportunity, especially with this new class of conservatives who had been elected in 2010, to try to get a consensus, a new consensus that would be more in the direction that we've been working for all these years. The first opportunity, I thought, was to see if we could rally Republican senators around the idea of a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution. And I discovered that there were a lot of different views as to what that ought to look like, and I immediately set to work, together with Mike Lee and others, to see if we could get everybody on the same page. We worked out a balanced budget amendment that would limit total federal spending to no more than 18% of GDP, far less than what we have today, require a supermajority of Congress to ever raise taxes, and require that we produce a balanced budget year in and year out. Because of the work that I did with Mike, we were able to get 47 out of 47 Republican senators to co-sponsor that. Now, that doesn't mean it's going to become law, but it means we have 47 Republican senators who are on record committed to a very solid set of conservative economic principles. That will serve us well. You know, Senator Reid decided for 3 consecutive years that it's perfectly acceptable for the majority party of the United States Senate to not even produce a budget. Just unbelievable to me. So unbelievable, I decided I would introduce my own. And I wrote my own budget in each of my first 2 years in the Senate. The fact is, I thought it was important that we not only talk about the general principles, but we demonstrate there's a way to get there. And so I wrote a budget that balances in 10 years without raising taxes. It gives us pro-growth tax reform, and it gets spending under control. I was criticized because it spent less money than the Ryan budget, the House Republican budget. But the fact is, it did something that that budget didn't do. It reached a balance. It reached a balance in 10 years, and I got more votes for my budget than any other budget on the Senate floor. That's, again, progress in uniting the conference, the Republican conference, in the right direction. Another example was before I was sworn in, but after I was elected in that few-month period after the 2010 election, the conference convened and we had a meeting. One of the things you have to do is adopt a new set of rules. Now, this is a meeting that happens behind closed doors. The last time that meeting had occurred, Jim DeMint stood up and insisted that the conference adopt a moratorium on earmarks. We Republicans were not going to ask for earmarks because we knew what a pernicious and wasteful program that was. Unfortunately, the only moratorium he could pass expired in 2 years, which meant as I was about to be sworn in, earmarks were about to come back. So I stood up within the Republican conference and said, you know, part of who we are is a party that's going to limit spending, especially the most egregiously wasteful spending. And so we need to continue this moratorium. There was a fight. There was a big argument, but I won that argument, and today we continue to have a moratorium on earmarks among Republican senators. So in one of the most one of the best honors that I've received, certainly since being elected to the Senate, is my fellow conservatives watched what I was doing and the modest success I was having in bringing our conference to a conservative consensus. And that's why last fall they asked me to take over from Jim DeMint when he decided to step down. They asked me to take over as the chairman of the Republican Steering Committee of the Senate. That's the conservative wing of the Republican Party in the Senate. And the guys who elected me to do that are the guys that you know, Marco Rubio and Jeff Flake and Rand Paul and Mike Lee and Ted Cruz and Ron Johnson. And it's really an honor and a privilege for me to be able to meet with them each week in a small group where we lay out our strategy and then we take it to the conference as a whole the following day. So a lot of this stuff doesn't make it into the news. You wouldn't know that it's going on, but I thought you'd want to know, and so I wanted to share it with you. Now, I will tell you, I also will spend time trying to work with folks on the other side of the aisle if they're going to help us advance our principles. Claire McCaskill is an example of a Democrat from Missouri who, she and I don't agree on much, but we agree on a ban on earmarks. And so together we have bipartisan legislation to not just have the Republican Party moratorium that we have today, but to pass a law so that it would be forbidden for anybody to have an earmark in the Congress. Jeanne Shaheen is a Democrat from New Hampshire, and again, there's not much we agree on, but one thing we agree on, the sugar program that forces taxpayers and consumers to subsidize a few wealthy sugar growers at the expense of all the rest of us is completely wrong. And she's joined me in an effort to end that program. And another example, and this is something I'm just really proud of, John Tester and Tom Carper, two Democrats, joined with me on a bill, actually a series of bills that significantly pushed back excessive regulation that was making it too expensive and too onerous and too difficult for companies to raise capital. And we call it the Jobs Act, and the fact is, because we worked together, we were able to get that signed into law, and today companies across Pennsylvania and across America are going public, they're raising capital, they're growing, in part because they're able to access capital that they couldn't have before. So I will tell you, I totally understand that my Democratic colleagues have a profoundly misguided political philosophy. That is true. But even a blind squirrel finds an acorn every once in a while. And so we need to be able to work together where we can. Let me now tell you what the hardest part of my job is. I think in some ways the hardest part about doing my job well is to do what I believe is right, even when many of my friends and supporters don't agree with me. And that does happen from time to time. And I think that's a real test of character because, you know, honestly, it's easy to do battle with your opponents. It's easy to go to battle with the people that you just know you just disagree with on almost everything. The hard part is what to do when you honestly believe that your friends are mistaken and they don't think they're mistaken. That's the real challenge of public service sometimes. There are a number of examples in this category too. Keith mentioned Rand Paul's filibuster. I can tell you a majority of Republican senators thought that was a really bad idea. But when I saw what Rand was doing, and when I saw that we had an administration that couldn't understand the answer to a simple question of whether or not the federal government has the legal right to kill an American citizen on American soil who is not an imminent threat to anyone, I said, you know, that's just too ridiculous for words. If this administration doesn't know the answer to that question, then by gosh, we better be down on the Senate floor. And I went down immediately and I joined Rand Paul. And I stood with him, and I'm proud that I did. And as a result, we ended up getting the administration to finally provide a belated answer to that question that should have been obvious. Another example is, I don't know if you've ever heard of this program. It's called the Transaction Guarantee Program. It sounds obscure, but it was actually a big deal. During the financial crisis, one of the many things the government did, many of which I thought were mistaken, was it provided a blanket, unlimited guarantee on all non-interest-bearing deposits, bank deposits. These are mostly accounts held by businesses at banks. And because the Treasury Secretary decided to do it, he unilaterally issued a blanket guarantee. Now, that meant taxpayers were on the hook for all of these otherwise uninsured deposits. There were no limits to this. And, you know, I had a problem with this. I also have a background in banking. I helped to launch a community bank. I was on the board of a community bank for a number of years. I've got lots of friends who are community bankers, and the community bankers supported me. Many of them came to me when this program was going to end, when the guarantee was going to expire. And they said, Pat, you know, we'd really like you to support continuing this program because it helps us. And so this was a case where I had to look my friends in the eye and say, I know it helps you, but this isn't the right thing to do. Taxpayers shouldn't be on the hook for private transactions. And when the Democrats went down to the Senate floor to continue this program, I personally went down and raised a point of order that struck it and killed it, and today that program is over. There's lots of other examples. A similar one is the Ex-Im Bank. You know, a lot of our friends in big business, they really like the Ex-Im Bank because this is a bank that guarantees borrowings by foreign companies and countries when they buy American products. The problem is that taxpayers are on the hook to guarantee those loans. And if a foreign country or a foreign government or a foreign corporation goes out of business after buying these products, guess who's stuck with the bill? We are. So I've long argued that this is a taxpayer subsidy of big business in this case, and it's wholly inappropriate. Now, I can tell you there's a lot of folks that were very supportive of my campaigns, feel very strongly that they want this program to continue. And they are not bashful about making that sentiment known. But again, it just doesn't seem right to me to force taxpayers to subsidize any kind of business. And so when the reauthorization came up, I introduced an amendment that would have phased out the Ex-Im Bank entirely. Now, my amendment failed, and when it did, I voted against reauthorizing the Ex-Im Bank, despite the pressure that they suggested. So I say this just to give you some context. The last couple of weeks, I know very well that the efforts that Joe Manchin and I engaged in are efforts that many, maybe most of the people in this room disagree with. And I understand that. I get that. But I do appreciate the fact that you're willing to hear me out, and I just appreciate being able to explain why I did what I did. And my hope is that we can agree to disagree on this and move on to the many, many areas in which we agree. But I should start by pointing out that I'm a gun owner. I have a lifetime rating with the NRA. The rating is A. And the Second Amendment has always been and continues to be very important to me. So I'm not going to I'm not trying to convince you that I'm right and you're wrong. But I do want you to understand why I did what I did. And there are a few reasons. One is the underlying language in the bill that the Democrats put on the floor was language I couldn't support. It went too far in a variety of ways. And I knew I wasn't going to be able to support that. But I did think there were some constructive things that we could do. So let me just walk through quickly, because there were a lot of inaccuracies about the bill that Joe Manchin and I ended up introducing. Basically, there's three parts, the way I think of it, three segments of this bill. One is it would have improved the state's participation in the existing background check system. A second thing that it would do is it would expand background checks for commercial purchases at gun shows and over the internet. And the third category is a whole raft of provisions that would allow law-abiding citizens to better enjoy and exercise the Second Amendment rights by getting rid of restrictions that we live with today. As far as the improving the state's participation, I should point out, we weren't creating a new system. We weren't suggesting any new criteria by which people who were adjudicated to be mentally unfit, there wouldn't be any new categories. It was just a matter of encouraging states to participate in the existing system that we have. And a lot of folks have said, you know, that wouldn't have prevented the Newtown massacre. That's absolutely true. It would not have. But it might have made a difference in the Virginia Tech incident, because, as you may know, the shooter in that case had already been adjudicated by the government of Virginia as dangerously mentally unstable and a threat. But they never provided that system that information, that data, to the background check system. So when this guy went to buy weapons, they ran a background check, and he came through with flying colors, and he left the store heavily armed. Now, if he had been turned down at that point, we don't know what would have happened. He might have gotten the gun somewhere else, of course. But something else might have happened as well. Some other event might have intervened. He might have gotten help. Who knows? But that's the first part. The more controversial part, I think, is expanding background checks to gun shows. And I understand that, but I do want to stress this is a measure that I voted for in 1999. And so did a big majority of House Republicans, and the NRA endorsed it. It's meant to do just one thing, and that is to make it harder for two classes of people who have no legal right to have a gun. That is, criminals who forfeited their right, and dangerously mentally ill people whom we've agreed as a society shouldn't be armed. It's meant to make that a little harder for them to obtain those weapons. Now, I understand a determined criminal will always be able to find a way to get a weapon, but forcing him to have an accomplice and making it a little bit more difficult, I thought made some sense. And one of the things that I think is really important is to think about the constitutional component of this. And you know, I don't hold myself out as a great constitutional scholar. I'm not even a lawyer. But there's somebody who I have enormous respect for, is Antonin Scalia. He's a great conservative. He's a great constitutional scholar. And he wrote a great decision, the Heller decision, which many of you probably know, which finally put to rest a debate that had been going on in this country for a long time. And the debate was about whether the Second Amendment is a collective right that belongs to states and is conditioned upon being a member of a militia, or, in contrast, is it an individual right that belongs to individual Americans? the conservative majority of the Supreme Court, led by Antonin Scalia, came to the correct conclusion, in my view. That's an individual right. It belongs to individuals, and it's not contingent on any participation in a militia. In that decision, Justice Scalia also specified, he chose to write, he didn't have to, but he chose to write that any laws that laws restricting the purchase of firearms by people who were not legally entitled to it, who did not deserve to enjoy Second Amendment rights, those such laws were perfectly constitutional. That was Justice Scalia. Another concern that I think is an understandable concern that people raise is whether this could lead to a gun registry. And I will tell you, there is no good reason to have a gun registry, and I will fight any effort to create a gun registry that might ever occur. And Joe Manchin and I totally agreed on this, and we felt so strongly about it that we put into the bill, and you can read it. Our bill was available for a week before the vote occurred. We specified that it would be a felony criminal crime if any federal employee whatsoever so much as began to compile data for the purpose of creating a registry, and that felony would be subject to 15 years imprisonment. I think that's a pretty tough measure to prevent any movement in the direction of a registry. The last thing I want to point out is that I was able to insist on a number of concessions that my Democratic friends did not want to agree to, but they did in this bill. Concessions that would allow law-abiding gun owners to, as I say, more freely exercise their Second Amendment rights. For instance, we have a provision that would secure interstate travel. You may be familiar with this. If you load up a shotgun in your vehicle perfectly in accordance with Pennsylvania law, but then drive through several states, and we have neighboring states that are not so friendly to gun owners, you will not be in compliance. You may not be in compliance with their laws, and people have been harassed and subject to arrest even because they don't meet the criteria, the regulatory regime in those other states. We take care of that by making it clear that a state couldn't impose that on people. We said that if you have a concealed carry permit, you shouldn't be required to go through another background check. You've already gone through one, and so a concealed carry permit would be deemed adequate ID for buying a firearm without another background check. We allowed people, in our legislation, people would be allowed to buy a handgun out of state. That's currently forbidden. There's no reason for that to be forbidden. We expanded people's freedom to do that. And I was surprised to discover that active duty military personnel, a Pennsylvanian who gets assigned to Fort Dix, is not allowed, by virtue of serving this country in uniform and being stationed in another state, you become precluded under existing law from buying a weapon in your home state. That makes no sense. We wiped that out. That was repealed in our bill. So I think we all know how this all turned out. My friends at the NRA opposed this. Other groups opposed it. There were some pro-Second Amendment groups that supported it. But in the end, clearly times have changed since 1999, and I was not able to persuade enough of my colleagues. We had the vote on Wednesday. I lost. I get that. This issue, I think, is probably resolved for now. And I want you to know that I intend to turn my attention to my usual wheelhouse. I am going to resume my focus on pushing back a government that is the main reason we have a miserable economy today. And pushing back on excessive regulation that is clearly choking off economic growth and trying to restore some common sense fiscal discipline so that we can get on a sustainable fiscal path. Let me just touch on two specific areas where I really think we all need to be focused, we need to be united, and we've got some big opportunities. The first, coming up soon, the President is going to announce any one of these days, not in the next few weeks, it's probably a couple of months away, but it's coming. He wants an increase in the debt ceiling. You know he does. You know he does. Not only that, the President wants more borrowing authority, and he wants no strings attached. His attitude is, He's run up a staggering record number of deficits, record-sized deficits, accumulated an incredible amount of debt that is already threatening, it's already costing us economic growth, and it's threatening our country in so many ways. And his attitude is he wants more borrowing authority with no conditions. I just feel very strongly Republicans need to stand up, and we need to insist this president gets no debt limit increase unless he agrees to put us on a path towards a balanced budget. Now, we know what we're going to hear from the administration. They're going to threaten to default on our debt. They're going to threaten to have all kinds of debacles. What they conveniently choose to overlook is the fact that ongoing tax revenue, in the event that we don't borrow any money for some period of time, ongoing tax revenue will cover 75% of everything the government's planning to spend. There is no reason whatsoever to have a default on our debt. We're not going to have a default on our debt. We can't allow ourselves to be intimidated into continuing this just borrowing, spending, irresponsible debt that we're piling on our kids. And so I hope we'll be united in fighting and holding the line on this. And the second one is a little bit more longer term, but by that I only mean a year or two. I'm here to tell you that Obamacare is unraveling right before our very eyes. That is happening. This bill, I have heard a lot of Republicans give a lot of speeches ripping into this bill, and it seems to me upon reflection that they have all understated how bad it is. It is unbelievable, but it's unraveling for them. Take the Class Act, right, the new long-term care entitlement. The funding for that was so fraudulent that even the Democrats conceded, and that's already been repealed. The exchanges that are the centerpiece of this whole administration's plan, they are not going to be ready by the October 1 deadline because they can't figure out how to do this. That's right. More than half of the Democrats in the Senate joined every single Republican senator to vote to repeal the medical device tax, which was extremely misguided. Health insurance costs, I mean, imagine the president kept insisting that this would lower health insurance costs. Health insurance costs are going through the roof for individuals and business, and they're costing us jobs today because all these expensive mandates kick in if you have 50 or more employees. Well, what do you think a company does that has 47 or 48 employees? They make sure not to hire anyone else. Can you imagine we would do this at a time like this? But we have, and people are starting to figure it out. They're already breaking their promise that the administration made to people with pre-existing conditions. All of this is happening already, and that's before the law even fully takes effect. I think the next thing that we're going to see is large employer-sponsored plan. Employers are going to drop coverage because the penalty, and they're already starting. I think we're going to see this happening. So my point is, the wheels are coming off. We knew this would happen. We said this would happen. We were right. Now, when it becomes obvious that this is completely untenable, what the Democrats are going to say is they're going to say, see, we told you can't trust the private sector to do this. Yep, you need to nationalize this. That's what we really need. That's what they're going to say. And that's why we Republicans in Congress, Keith and his colleagues, and on our side of the Capitol, we need to be prepared for this. We need to have a plan. We need to be on offense and make sure that we repeal this bill and we replace it. We got to replace it with a market-based system that puts patients at the center, not bureaucrats. That's what this is about. So folks, I just want to tell you, these are there is no shortage of really important challenges that we face. I am very, very eagerly looking forward to getting back in this fight on these fiscal issues, on these regulatory issues. As I mentioned before, there's a reason that we have the worst economic recovery from a recession in the history of this republic. It's because when you pursue the policies of Jimmy Carter, you get the economic outcomes of Jimmy Carter. That's what's happening here. The federal government is creating the headwind that is preventing us from having the economic growth and the job creation and the opportunity and the elevated standard of living that we could be having, that we should be having. And if we can win some more seats, and if we hold together, that we will be having. We can have a very, very bright future. We can have the kind of recovery we deserve, our kids deserve. We can do it. We'll do it by restoring conservative free market principles. I hope you'll continue to support me in my efforts. Thank you very much for having me here today. Thank you.